Have you ever wondered why the book of Genesis feels like it's hiding something? Why certain verses seem to skip over massive details that could change everything we think we know about early humanity? Tonight we're diving into one of the most controversial and deliberately obscured encounters in all of Scripture. An encounter so shocking, so earth-shattering that religious scholars have spent centuries trying to explain it away or bury it in footnotes. What if I told you that Adam, the first man created by God's own hands, came face to face with beings so terrifying, so otherworldly, that their very existence threatens to unravel the neat little Sunday school stories we've been told our entire lives? What if the Garden of Eden wasn't the peaceful paradise we imagine, but ground zero for a cosmic war that's still raging today? The Nephilim, giants, fallen ones. Whatever name you use, these beings represent one of the Bible's most explosive secrets. And their connection to Adam? That's a story the church doesn't want you to hear. Because if you knew the truth about what really happened when Adam encountered these supernatural entities, it would shatter your understanding of good and evil, of humanity's true origin, and of the battle that's been waging for your soul since the very beginning. I'm not talking about mythology here. I'm not spinning fairy tales or chasing conspiracy theories. What I'm about to reveal comes straight from the pages of Scripture itself, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to dig beneath the surface. The Hebrew text contains clues that most translations deliberately soften or ignore completely. Ancient rabbinical writings preserve accounts that modern Christianity has swept under the rug, and archaeological discoveries keep unearthing evidence that these beings were not only real, but active in ways that will make your blood run cold. Comment 777 if you're ready to have your worldview completely transformed. Because once you see what Genesis really says about Adam's encounter with the Nephilim, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. The truth is too big, too terrifying, and too urgent to ignore. And before we dive into this forbidden knowledge, I want to thank every single one of you who've supported this channel through your super thanks and comments. You're not just viewers, you're fellow seekers of truth in a world drowning in deception. Your courage to question, to seek, to dig deeper is what makes revelations like this possible. Now let's begin this journey into the shadows of Genesis, where giants walked among men and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Genesis chapter 6. Most people read it like a bedtime story, but the Hebrew text tells a different tale entirely. When it speaks of the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men, we're not reading about some innocent romance. We're witnessing the documentation of an invasion, a deliberate corruption of the human bloodline that would echo through every generation until the flood waters rose to wash the earth clean. But here's what they don't teach you in seminary. Adam was still alive when this happened. Think about that for a moment. The man who walked with God in the cool of the evening, who named every creature, who witnessed the birth of civilization itself, was present during the most catastrophic genetic disaster in human history. He didn't just hear about the Nephilim secondhand, he saw them, he encountered them. And according to ancient texts that didn't make it into your Bible, he fought them. The timeline is crystal clear when you do the math. Adam lived 930 years. The Nephilim emerged in the days of his descendants while he was still breathing, still remembering what humanity was supposed to be before these abominations corrupted everything. Can you imagine the horror? The man who knew God's original design for mankind watching as supernatural beings twisted that design into something monstrous? Now the word Nephilim itself should send chills down your spine. In Hebrew, it comes from the root word naphal, meaning to fall. But this isn't talking about a simple stumble. This is a violent, catastrophic fall from grace. These were beings who abandoned their proper dwelling place, as Jude tells us, and descended to earth with one purpose: corruption. But here's where it gets disturbing. Ancient Jewish texts, including the Book of Enoch, describe these fallen beings as beautiful beyond human comprehension. They didn't appear as monsters at first. They came as teachers, as benefactors, as gods offering forbidden knowledge. They taught humanity metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, sorcery. They appeared to be advancing civilization, but they were actually poisoning it at its very source. And Adam watched it all unfold. Picture this scene. You're the first human being created perfect, sinless until that moment in the garden when everything changed. You've lived for centuries watching your children and their children spread across the earth. You remember what it was like before the fall, when communication with the divine realm was natural and pure. Then suddenly these entities appear. They claim to be from heaven, but something about them feels wrong. Their beauty is too perfect, too seductive. Their knowledge comes with a price that humanity doesn't yet understand. The ancient texts tell us that Adam tried to warn people. He knew the difference between holy angels and these fallen ones because he had walked with both. He had seen Gabriel's glory and Michael's righteousness. But these beings, these Nephilim and their fathers, carried a different energy entirely. They radiated power, yes, but it was power corrupted. Power turned against its original purpose. Think about the psychological torment Adam must have endured. He was already carrying the weight of introducing sin into the world through his disobedience in Eden. Now he's watching as supernatural beings exploit that very sin nature to corrupt his entire bloodline. Every child born with giant stature, every human exhibiting supernatural abilities that shouldn't exist, every act of violence that exceeded normal human capacity. It all traced back to this invasion that happened on his watch. The Book of Jubilees, considered scripture by some ancient Jewish communities, describes how Adam spent his final years in intense prayer and fasting, pleading with God to intervene before the corruption became irreversible. He saw the signs before anyone else did. The unnatural growth rates, the superhuman strength, the insatiable violence that began spreading like a plague through human settlements. But here's what's truly chilling. Adam didn't just observe this corruption from a distance. According to multiple ancient sources, he was specifically targeted by these entities. Why? Because he alone remembered the original design. He was the only human alive who had experienced direct, unfiltered communion with the Creator. He represented everything these fallen beings were trying to destroy. Some texts describe supernatural beings approaching Adam directly, offering him knowledge and power that would make him like God again. Sound familiar? It's the same temptation that worked in Eden, but now amplified through beings of incredible power and influence. They promise to undo the consequences of his fall, to restore him to his original state, to give him dominion over the growing population of giants and their hybrid offspring. But Adam had learned something crucial from his first encounter with deception. He recognized the voice of the serpent even when it came through beings of light. He understood that true restoration could only come through God's mercy, not through bargaining with fallen powers. And this is where the story takes a turn that will shake you to your core. Adam said no, not just once, but repeatedly. Ancient accounts describe a series of confrontations where Adam refused the offers of these supernatural beings even when they threatened him, even when they demonstrated their power over his descendants, even when they showed him the growing army of giants that his rejection would leave him powerless to stop. And that's when things got violent. You see, the Nephilim weren't content to simply corrupt humanity through intermarriage and genetic manipulation. They needed to eliminate the one man who could still remember and teach others about humanity's original purpose. Adam became enemy number one in a supernatural war that was raging all around him. The ancient texts describe attacks on Adam's dwelling place. Supernatural beings appearing to him in visions and dreams, attempts to drive him insane with glimpses of the future destruction that his bloodline would face. They showed him visions of the flood, of his descendants drowning in divine judgment, all while offering him the power to prevent it if he would just submit to their authority. But something extraordinary happened during these confrontations. Adam began to understand something about spiritual warfare that no human had ever grasped before. He realized that these beings, for all their power and knowledge, were still operating under limitations. They could influence, they could corrupt, they could deceive, but they could not force the human will into submission without consent. This discovery would change everything. Because if the first man could resist the direct assault of fallen supernatural beings, then every human who came after him had that same potential. The corruption spreading through the bloodline was real, the giants were multiplying, the violence was escalating toward inevitable judgment. But the spark of divine image in humanity could not be completely extinguished by external force. And that's when Adam made a decision that the modern church has completely forgotten about. A decision so radical, so dangerous that it would set the stage for every spiritual battle that followed. But before I reveal what Adam did next, you need to understand something crucial about the nature of these Nephilim that most people miss entirely. They weren't just big humans with attitude problems. They were something far more sinister, far more intelligent, and far more connected to the cosmic rebellion that began in heavenly realms long before humanity ever existed. These beings possessed knowledge that shouldn't have existed on Earth. They understood the fundamental structures of reality itself, the hidden mechanisms that governed matter and energy, the secret names and frequencies that could bend the physical world to their will. This wasn't primitive magic or superstition. This was advanced understanding of creation's blueprint, twisted for purposes that would make angels weep. The ancient texts describe technologies that sound eerily familiar to modern ears. The Nephilim taught humans how to manipulate metals in ways that created weapons of unprecedented destruction. They revealed architectural techniques that allowed the construction of megalithic structures that still puzzle engineers today. They shared medical knowledge that extended human lifespan unnaturally, creating hybrid beings that could live for centuries while growing to enormous proportions. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This knowledge came with a price that humanity didn't understand until it was too late. Every technique, every innovation, every advancement these beings shared contained a spiritual component that bound the recipients to their fallen nature. Learning their metallurgy meant invoking their spiritual authority. Using their architectural methods meant incorporating their symbols and geometries into human settlements. Applying their medical knowledge meant accepting their definition of what humanity should become. Adam watched in horror as his descendants eagerly embraced these teachings without understanding the spiritual contracts they were signing. Each generation became more dependent on this supernatural guidance, more accepting of the beings who provided it, more willing to intermarry with their offspring despite the obvious corruption it produced. The giants weren't just physically imposing, they were spiritually toxic. Their very presence warped the spiritual atmosphere around them, making it harder for humans to hear God's voice, harder to resist temptation, harder to maintain the moral boundaries that kept civilization from descending into chaos. Wherever they settled, violence erupted. Wherever they established their influence, the worship of false gods followed. Wherever they bred with human women, the children carried both physical abnormalities and spiritual predispositions toward rebellion that seemed impossible to overcome. Ancient accounts describe Adam traveling from settlement to settlement, desperately trying to warn people about what was happening. But who was going to listen to an old man talking about spiritual corruption when these magnificent beings were offering immediate solutions to every human problem? Who was going to choose the narrow path of divine obedience when the wide road of supernatural empowerment was right there for the taking? The frustration must have been overwhelming. Adam could see the patterns that others missed because he remembered what normal looked like. He could recognize the spiritual signatures of these fallen beings because he had experienced genuine divine presence before the fall. He could predict the consequences of accepting their gifts because he understood the nature of spiritual authority and how it operated across generations. But knowledge without power is its own form of torment. Adam could diagnose the disease, but he couldn't cure it. He could see the trap, but he couldn't prevent his descendants from walking into it. He could prophesy the judgment that such corruption would inevitably bring, but he couldn't convince people to change course while the benefits of cooperating with these beings seemed so immediate and tangible. That's when something remarkable happened. God began speaking to Adam again in ways he hadn't since the expulsion from Eden. Not through direct conversation like the old days, but through visions, through prophetic dreams, through supernatural encounters that gave Adam glimpses of the larger cosmic conflict he had unknowingly become part of. These revelations were staggering. Adam learned that the corruption of humanity wasn't just a random disaster, or the unfortunate result of poor choices by supernatural beings. It was part of a calculated strategy in a war that had begun in heaven itself, long before the creation of mankind. The Nephilim and their fallen fathers weren't rogue agents operating independently. They were soldiers in an organized rebellion against divine authority, and humanity was both their weapon and their target. The plan was diabolically brilliant in its simplicity. If these beings could corrupt the human bloodline thoroughly enough, if they could twist the divine image in mankind beyond recognition, if they could create a hybrid race that was more loyal to them than to their creator, then they could potentially claim legal authority over the earth itself. Dominion had been given to mankind in the beginning. But if mankind could be transformed into something else entirely, then that dominion could be transferred to their new masters. Adam realized he wasn't just watching the corruption of his descendants. He was witnessing an attempted coup of cosmic proportions, with the earth as the prize and humanity as the unwitting accomplice. This understanding changed everything about how Adam viewed his role in these unfolding events. He wasn't just a concerned grandfather trying to protect his family from bad influences. He was the key witness in a legal battle that would determine the future ownership of creation itself. His testimony about humanity's original design, his memory of what people were supposed to be before the corruption began, his resistance to the fallen beings' offers and threats. All of this was evidence in a case being argued in heavenly courts. But the pressure was enormous. Every day the corruption spread further. Every generation produced more giants, more violence, more acceptance of the new reality these beings were creating. The window for intervention was closing rapidly, and Adam could feel the weight of divine justice building like a storm on the horizon. The ancient texts described this period as Adam's greatest test, even more challenging than the original temptation in Eden. Because in Eden he only had to choose between obedience and rebellion for himself. Now he was being asked to stand firm while watching everything he loved be systematically destroyed by forces he couldn't physically defeat. Yet something extraordinary was happening in the spiritual realm during these confrontations. Each time Adam refused the offers of the fallen beings, each time he rejected their attempts to recruit him as an ally, each time he maintained his testimony about humanity's original purpose despite the overwhelming evidence of its corruption, he was establishing legal precedent that would echo through every generation that followed. His resistance proved that even fallen humanity retained enough of the divine image to choose righteousness over convenience, truth over comfort, divine authority over supernatural power. This precedent would become crucial in the cosmic legal battle that was building toward an inevitable climax, because God was preparing something that would shock both heaven and earth. Something that would demonstrate his absolute authority over all creation, both physical and spiritual. Something that would reset the entire cosmic order and establish once and for all who really held dominion over the earth and everything in it. The flood wasn't just coming to wash away physical corruption. It was coming as a divine legal judgment that would settle the question of authority that these fallen beings had raised through their invasion of humanity. And Adam's testimony, his resistance, his refusal to submit to their alternative government, would be presented as evidence that mankind was still redeemable, still worth saving, still capable of fulfilling the original purpose for which they had been created. But first, Adam had to survive long enough to see that judgment arrive. And the fallen beings, recognizing the threat he represented to their entire strategy, were about to escalate their campaign against him in ways that would test the very limits of what it means to be human. The confrontation that was coming would determine not just Adam's fate, but the spiritual trajectory of every human soul that would ever be born after him. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The spiritual forces arrayed against him couldn't have been more powerful, and the outcome couldn't have been less certain. Yet in the growing darkness of a world being consumed by supernatural corruption, one man stood firm in the truth he had learned through bitter experience. One man refused to forget what humanity was supposed to be. One man maintained his testimony against impossible odds, and that testimony was about to change the course of history itself. The battle lines were drawn in ways that most people couldn't see. While human settlements continued their daily routines, trading goods, building homes, raising children, an invisible war was raging in the spiritual dimensions that surrounded them. Adam found himself at the epicenter of this conflict, not by choice but by necessity. He was the living bridge between two worlds, the only human who could testify to what had been lost and what might still be recovered. The fallen beings grew increasingly desperate as they realized their timeline was shortening. Divine judgment was approaching like a slow-moving storm, and they needed to consolidate their control before the hammer fell. Their strategy shifted from seduction to intimidation, from offering gifts to making demands, from playing the role of benevolent teachers to revealing their true nature as cosmic tyrants. Ancient records describe supernatural manifestations around Adam's dwelling that defied natural law. Objects would move without being touched. The temperature would drop suddenly in the middle of summer heat. Voices would speak from empty air, sometimes in languages that hadn't been invented yet, sometimes in frequencies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones. These weren't random hauntings or coincidental phenomena. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to break Adam's resolve through sustained terror. But something unexpected was happening to Adam during these assaults. Instead of weakening his resistance, they were strengthening his understanding of spiritual authority. Each attack revealed something new about the limitations these beings operated under. They could manipulate physical objects, but only within certain boundaries. They could project voices and images, but couldn't actually read his thoughts without permission. They could create fear, but couldn't force his submission without his consent. This knowledge was revolutionary. Adam began to realize that these supposedly all-powerful entities were actually operating under a complex system of spiritual laws that governed their interactions with humanity. They had tremendous capabilities within their authorized sphere of influence, but they were absolutely restricted from crossing certain lines without divine permission or human invitation. The implications were staggering. If these beings needed consent to fully manifest their power over humans, then every person who had submitted to their authority had done so through some form of agreement. whether conscious or unconscious. The corruption spreading through humanity wasn't the result of unstoppable supernatural force. It was the consequence of choices made by people who didn't understand what they were agreeing to. This revelation sparked something in Adam that hadn't burned since his days in Eden. Hope. Not naive optimism, but genuine spiritual hope based on understanding rather than wishful thinking. If the enemy operated under limitations, then victory was still possible. If human will remained the deciding factor in spiritual authority, then the battle wasn't over no matter how dire the circumstances appeared. Adam began to experiment with this knowledge, testing the boundaries of spiritual authority in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone else. When supernatural manifestations appeared around his dwelling, he would speak directly to them, not in fear, but in the authority that came from remembering his original commission as God's image-bearer on earth. When voices threatened him with visions of future catastrophe, he would respond with declarations of divine sovereignty that seemed to cause the phenomena to weaken or withdraw entirely. The results were remarkable. Adam discovered that these fallen beings, for all their knowledge and power, were fundamentally bound by the same spiritual laws that governed all created things. They could influence, corrupt, and deceive, but they could not override the fundamental structure of reality that placed human will at the center of earthly authority. Every expansion of their power required human cooperation. Every manifestation of their presence needed human permission, whether given knowingly or through spiritual ignorance. But this knowledge came with a terrible burden. If Adam was right about the mechanics of spiritual authority, then every person who had submitted to these beings could theoretically withdraw their consent and break free from the corruption. The giants roaming the earth, the hybrid offspring multiplying in every settlement, the technologies and knowledge systems spreading supernatural influence through human civilization. All of it was ultimately dependent on human choices that could theoretically be reversed. Yet how could he convince people to reject powers and abilities that had become integral to their daily survival? How could he persuade them to abandon knowledge that had advanced their civilization centuries beyond what should have been possible? How could he ask them to give up the very advantages that made them feel superior to their ancestors? The psychological and social obstacles were overwhelming. The corruption had become so normalized that most people couldn't imagine life without it. Children were being born who had never known a world where giants didn't rule over human settlements, where supernatural knowledge wasn't considered the highest form of education, where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms weren't constantly blurred by the presence of otherworldly beings. Adam found himself in the position of trying to convince people that their greatest achievements were actually their greatest disasters, that their most impressive capabilities were signs of spiritual bondage, that their most beautiful and powerful leaders were actually enemies of everything they claimed to represent. It was an impossible message to deliver to people who were experiencing immediate benefits from their cooperation with these supernatural entities. The ancient texts describe Adam's growing isolation during this period. Even among his own direct descendants, few were willing to listen to warnings that seemed to contradict everything their experience was teaching them. Why should they fear beings who had given them longer lifespans, greater strength, advanced technologies, and knowledge of mysteries that previous generations could never have imagined? The gap between spiritual reality and physical experience had become so wide that truth itself seemed irrelevant to daily life. People were making decisions based on immediate results rather than long-term consequences, on visible benefits rather than invisible spiritual costs, on the testimony of beings who claimed divine authority rather than the warnings of an old man who talked about a paradise they had never seen. This created a profound spiritual crisis for Adam. He possessed knowledge that could potentially save his descendants from catastrophic judgment, but he lacked the power to make them listen. He understood the mechanics of the trap they were walking into, but he couldn't force them to change direction. He could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon of divine justice, but he couldn't convince people to seek shelter while the sun was still shining on their corrupt prosperity. The weight of this responsibility drove Adam to levels of intercession that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Ancient accounts describe him spending days in prayer and fasting, pleading with God to intervene before the corruption became irreversible. He would climb mountains to get closer to heaven, seeking any form of divine communication that might provide guidance for how to proceed. He would study the movements of stars and weather patterns, looking for signs of when the judgment might arrive and how much time remained for repentance. During one of these intensive prayer sessions, something extraordinary happened that changed the entire trajectory of Adam's mission. The ancient texts describe a visitation that was unlike anything he had experienced since leaving Eden. Not a dream or a vision, but an actual encounter with a messenger whose presence carried the unmistakable signature of divine authority. The message was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it confirmed that judgment was indeed coming, and much sooner than Adam had hoped. The corruption had reached a tipping point where divine intervention was no longer optional, but necessary to preserve any remnant of uncorrupted humanity. Comforting because it revealed that Adam's resistance hadn't been in vain. His testimony about humanity's original design had been heard and recorded in heavenly courts as evidence that mankind remained redeemable despite the overwhelming corruption. But the most shocking part of the message wasn't about the coming flood or the preservation of a righteous remnant. It was about Adam's own role in the events that were about to unfold. He wasn't just a witness to this cosmic conflict. He was a key player whose choices would influence the legal and spiritual framework within which divine judgment would operate. The messenger revealed that Adam's consistent refusal to submit to the fallen being's authority had established crucial legal precedent in the heavenly courts. Every time he had rejected their offers, every time he had maintained his testimony about humanity's original purpose, every time he had exercised spiritual authority based on his commission as God's image-bearer rather than supernatural power borrowed from rebellious entities, he had been strengthening the legal foundation that would justify both the coming judgment and the preservation of a faithful remnant. This wasn't just about Adam's personal salvation or even the salvation of his immediate family. His choices were creating spiritual and legal precedents that would govern how divine authority interacted with human will throughout all future generations. The principles he was establishing through his resistance would become part of the fundamental framework within which redemption would operate for every human being who would ever live after the flood. The implications were staggering. Adam realized he wasn't just fighting for his own generation's survival. He was fighting for the spiritual freedom of every human soul that would ever be born. His resistance to supernatural tyranny was establishing the legal right of every future person to choose divine authority over fallen power, truth over deception, redemption over corruption. But this revelation also brought a new level of pressure. If the stakes were this high, if the spiritual precedents he was setting would echo through all future generations, then every choice he made in the days ahead would carry consequences beyond anything he had previously imagined. The fallen beings weren't just trying to corrupt his generation. They were trying to establish legal precedents that would bind all future humanity under their authority. The battle was no longer just about physical survival or even spiritual purity. It was about the fundamental question of who would have legal authority over human destiny throughout all future ages. Would humanity remain under divine authority with the freedom to choose redemption despite their fallen condition? Or would they be bound under the authority of beings whose rebellion had forfeited any claim to legitimate governance? Adam understood that he was standing at the fulcrum point of history. His choices in the days ahead would determine not just whether humanity survived the coming judgment, but whether they survived it with their essential nature intact. The fallen beings were making one final desperate attempt to corrupt the legal framework of reality itself, to establish their authority as permanent and unquestionable. And they were about to reveal just how far they were willing to go to achieve that goal. The attacks against Adam escalated beyond anything he had previously experienced. Physical manifestations gave way to direct spiritual assaults that targeted the core of his identity. The fallen beings began appearing to him in forms designed to create maximum psychological trauma, sometimes taking the shape of his deceased children, sometimes manifesting as distorted versions of his own appearance, sometimes presenting themselves as divine messengers bearing false revelations that contradicted everything he knew to be true. These weren't random harassment tactics. They were sophisticated psychological operations designed to break down his confidence in his own memory and judgment. If they could make him doubt his recollections of Eden, if they could convince him that his understanding of spiritual authority was flawed, if they could get him to question whether his resistance was actually rebellion against legitimate divine representatives, then they could potentially get him to voluntarily submit to their authority. The pressure was enormous because some of their arguments contained elements of truth twisted into deceptive conclusions. They would remind him of his failure in Eden, suggesting that his disobedience had forfeited his right to speak with divine authority. They would point to the suffering his descendants were experiencing because of his fall, implying that their intervention was actually merciful correction of his mistakes. They would show him visions of the coming flood and argue that cooperation with them was the only way to save his family from divine wrath. These temptations were far more subtle and dangerous than anything he had faced in the garden. In Eden, the choice had been between obedience and disobedience, between trusting God and trusting the serpent. Now the choice was between different claims to divine authority, between competing interpretations of spiritual truth, between alternative versions of what redemption might look like. Adam found himself in the terrifying position of having to discern between authentic divine communication and sophisticated spiritual counterfeits, while under intense psychological pressure and without access to the clear, direct divine fellowship he had known before the fall. Every decision carried enormous consequences, not just for himself but for all future humanity. Every moment of doubt or confusion was seized upon by his adversaries as an opportunity to introduce new levels of deception. Yet something remarkable was happening in the midst of this spiritual warfare. Adam was developing capabilities he had never possessed even in his unfallen state. The pressure was forcing him to rely on spiritual discernment rather than physical evidence, on faith rather than sight, on principles rather than feelings. He was learning to recognize divine authority not by its appearance or its claims, but by its alignment with the fundamental character of truth itself. This process was transforming him into something unprecedented in human experience. He remained fully human, but he was becoming a human who understood spiritual reality at levels that even unfallen angels might envy. His resistance to deception was developing into positive spiritual sight that could penetrate the most sophisticated illusions these fallen beings could create. And they were beginning to realize that their strategy was backfiring. Instead of breaking Adam down, the pressure was building him up into exactly the kind of witness they couldn't afford to have testifying against them in the cosmic legal proceedings that were approaching. His growing spiritual maturity was making him more dangerous to their cause, not less. That's when they made the decision that would seal their own doom and guarantee their defeat in ways they couldn't possibly foresee. They decided to eliminate Adam permanently, but first they would make one final offer that would test the very limits of what it means to choose between life and death, between temporal survival and eternal significance, between human wisdom and divine truth. The offer they were about to make would be so compelling, so reasonable, so perfectly tailored to Adam's deepest fears and highest hopes, that refusing it would require a level of faith that had never been demanded of any human being in history. And Adam's response would determine whether humanity entered the post-flood world with the spiritual framework necessary for eventual redemption, or whether they emerged from judgment already bound under authorities that would make true freedom impossible for all future generations. The stage was set for the most crucial spiritual battle in human history. And everything hung in the balance. The final confrontation came at dawn on a morning that would forever divide human history into before and after. Ancient texts describe the sky itself seeming to hold its breath as supernatural forces gathered around Adam's dwelling like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. This wasn't going to be another night of whispered threats or psychological manipulation. The fallen beings had decided to end this conflict once and for all, but their approach this time was different, terrifyingly different. Instead of appearing as intimidating giants or seductive teachers, they manifested in forms of almost unbearable beauty and majesty. Light seemed to emanate from their very beings, not the harsh glare of earthly fire, but something that appeared to be the pure radiance of heaven itself. Their voices carried harmonies that made the music of creation itself sound like discordant noise in comparison. When they spoke to Adam, it wasn't with the arrogance or threats he had grown accustomed to. Their tone was sorrowful, almost pleading, like cosmic physicians delivering a terminal diagnosis to a beloved patient. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as reluctant executioners carrying out a divine mandate they wished they could avoid. The message they delivered was crafted with diabolical brilliance. They claimed to be authentic messengers from the Most High, sent to offer Adam one final opportunity for redemption before the floodwaters destroyed everything he had ever known or loved. They showed him visions of the coming catastrophe that were so vivid, so detailed, so emotionally devastating that he could feel the water rising around his children's children, could hear their screams as they realized no amount of giant strength or supernatural knowledge could save them from divine judgment. But then came the offer that made Adam's blood run cold. They claimed they had been authorized to preserve a remnant of humanity, but only if Adam would acknowledge their authority as legitimate representatives of divine will. All he had to do was admit that his resistance had been misguided rebellion against heaven's chosen agents. All he had to do was publicly renounce his testimony about humanity's original design and accept their version of what mankind was meant to become. All he had to do was bow, one simple act of submission, they explained, and they would use their power to protect thousands of his descendants from the coming flood. They showed him detailed plans for ark-like vessels that could house entire communities, technologies that could create underwater cities, supernatural abilities that could allow humans to survive beneath the waves until the judgment passed. The lives of countless innocent people hung in the balance, they claimed, and his stubborn pride was the only thing standing between them and salvation. The psychological pressure was beyond anything Adam had previously experienced. These beings weren't just threatening him anymore. They were offering to save others at the cost of his own spiritual integrity. They were presenting his resistance not as heroic faithfulness, but as selfish stubbornness that would result in the deaths of people he loved more than his own life. The ancient texts describe Adam falling to his knees under the weight of this moral dilemma. Every instinct he had developed as a father, grandfather, and patriarch of the human race screamed at him to accept their offer. What was his personal spiritual purity worth compared to the lives of thousands of innocent people? What was his testimony about abstract spiritual principles worth compared to the concrete salvation of his own flesh and blood? For hours, Adam wrestled with this decision while the supernatural beings waited with expressions of patient sorrow, like divine surgeons prepared to perform a necessary but tragic operation. They didn't pressure him or rush his deliberation. They simply maintained their vigil. occasionally adding new details about the people who would die if he refused. New descriptions of the suffering that could be prevented if he would just humble himself and accept their authority. But as Adam prayed through this impossible choice, something began to emerge from the depths of his spirit that surprised even him. A clarity that cut through the emotional manipulation like a sword through fog. A recognition that pierced the sophisticated deception like light through darkness. A understanding that revealed the true nature of what was being offered and what was being demanded in return. He realized that these beings weren't offering to save people from divine judgment. They were offering to preserve them under their own authority, which would mean those people would survive the flood but lose their souls in the process. The rescue they promised would transform the survivors into something that was no longer truly human, something that belonged to them rather than to God. Something that could never again choose redemption because the capacity for genuine choice would have been surgically removed through spiritual submission. The offer wasn't mercy. It was a trap designed to capture not just Adam but everyone he cared about. His submission wouldn't save his descendants. It would damn them to a fate worse than physical death. It would preserve their bodies while destroying the very thing that made them worth saving in the first place. This realization brought a peace that Adam hadn't felt since his days in Eden. Not because the choice became easy, but because it became clear. He wasn't being asked to choose between his spiritual integrity and other people's lives. He was being asked to choose between temporary physical preservation and eternal spiritual freedom for all future humanity. When Adam finally stood and faced these magnificent, terrible beings, his voice carried an authority that made them step backward despite themselves. He didn't shout or rage or deliver a dramatic speech. He simply spoke the truth with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally seen through the last and greatest deception they could devise. He told them he knew who they really were. He told them he understood what they were really offering. He told them that no amount of physical salvation was worth the spiritual enslavement they demanded in return. And then he did something that sent shockwaves through both the physical and spiritual realms. He commanded them to leave, not in his own authority, but in the authority of the one whose image he bore, whose commission he carried, whose truth he had chosen to uphold regardless of the cost. He spoke with the voice of someone who had remembered what it meant to be human in the fullest sense of the word. Someone who understood that true humanity meant bearing divine authority rather than submitting to fallen power. The effect was instantaneous and devastating for these supernatural beings. Their beautiful forms began to waver and distort like mirages in desert heat. Their harmonious voices became discordant shrieks that hurt the ears and made the ground tremble. Their claims to divine authority crumbled like sandcastles before a tsunami as the authentic spiritual authority Adam was exercising exposed them for what they really were. But their retreat wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because if they couldn't corrupt Adam through deception, if they couldn't break him through pressure, if they couldn't recruit him through false mercy, then they would have to destroy him through direct spiritual assault. The ancient texts describe what happened next as the most violent supernatural conflict in human history up to that point. These beings abandoned all pretense of divine authority and revealed their true nature as cosmic rebels, whose hatred for everything God had created burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. They attacked Adam not just physically and psychologically, but spiritually, attempting to tear apart the very fabric of his soul. The assault came in waves that defied natural law. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp around Adam as these entities unleashed powers that they had been holding in reserve throughout all their previous encounters. The air became thick with spiritual electricity that made breathing difficult. The ground beneath his feet alternated between feeling solid and feeling like quicksand. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably, making it impossible to tell whether seconds or hours were passing. But something extraordinary was happening to Adam during this attack. Instead of being overwhelmed by powers beyond his ability to resist, he was discovering resources within himself that he had never known existed. The same spiritual authority that had allowed him to command these beings to leave was now protecting him from their most violent assaults. Every attack they launched against him was being turned back by forces they couldn't see or understand. It was as if Adam had become a lightning rod for divine power, channeling spiritual energy that was flowing through him rather than from him. The harder these fallen beings struck, the brighter this protective authority blazed around him. Their own violence was being used to demonstrate the very spiritual principles that Adam had been trying to explain to his descendants for centuries. The battle raged for what seemed like days, though the distortion of time made it impossible to measure accurately. Adam found himself fighting not just for his own survival, but for the preservation of truths that would be needed by generations not yet born. Every moment he continued to resist was another moment that the legal precedents he had established remained intact. Every second he maintained his testimony was another second that the spiritual framework for human redemption remained uncompromised. But the fallen beings were growing desperate as they realized their attacks were having the opposite effect they intended. Instead of destroying Adam's authority, their violence was amplifying it. Instead of proving their superior power, their assault was demonstrating their fundamental limitations. Instead of establishing their dominion over humanity, their failure was confirming humanity's right to choose divine authority over fallen rebellion. That's when they made the decision that would guarantee their ultimate defeat in ways they couldn't possibly foresee. They decided to appeal to higher authorities, to call upon powers and principalities that had remained hidden throughout the entire conflict, entities so dark and destructive that even fallen angels approached them with terror and trembling. The ancient texts become almost incoherent when describing what emerged from the deepest spiritual darkness in response to this appeal. These weren't beings in any recognizable sense. They were more like concentrated malevolence given form, pure hatred and rebellion distilled into entities that existed for no purpose other than the complete annihilation of everything God had ever created or might create in the future. When these ultimate powers of darkness turned their attention toward Adam, the very fabric of reality around him began to unravel. The protective spiritual authority that had shielded him from every previous attack started to buckle under pressures that no created being was designed to withstand. For the first time since the confrontation began, Adam felt the real possibility that he might not survive what was coming. But just as the darkness seemed ready to swallow him completely, just as the forces arrayed against him reached levels that would have vaporized entire mountains, something happened that changed the rules of engagement forever. The sky split open like a scroll being torn in half, and a voice spoke that made every other sound in creation fall silent. It wasn't a voice that could be heard with physical ears. It was a voice that bypassed hearing entirely and spoke directly to the core of every conscious being within 1,000 miles. A voice that carried such absolute authority that even the darkest powers of rebellion had no choice but to acknowledge its sovereignty. The message was simple, but its implications were staggering. The voice announced that the time for this conflict had ended. The legal proceedings that had been building throughout Adam's resistance were now concluded. The precedents had been established, the testimony had been recorded, and the judgment was about to be executed. But more importantly, the voice declared that Adam's faithfulness had been accepted as sufficient evidence that humanity retained enough of the divine image to justify preservation and eventual redemption. His resistance to corruption, his refusal to submit to fallen authority, his willingness to choose truth over comfort and spiritual integrity over physical survival, had satisfied the legal requirements necessary to proceed with the plan that had been in preparation since before the foundation of the world. The flood wasn't just coming to destroy corruption. It was coming to reset the entire cosmic order based on the spiritual and legal precedents that Adam had established through his confrontation with the powers of darkness. Humanity would emerge from the waters not just physically cleansed, but spiritually positioned for a redemption story that would ultimately result in the complete defeat of every force that had ever opposed divine authority. The fallen beings and their dark reinforcements had no choice but to withdraw. Not because they were physically defeated, but because they had been legally outmaneuvered in ways that left them without any remaining claims to authority over human destiny. Their own violence against Adam had provided the final evidence needed to strip them of every legitimate right they might have claimed to govern or influence humanity's future. As the supernatural entities retreated into whatever dimensions of exile awaited them, Adam found himself alone for the first time in months. The spiritual pressure that had been building around him dissipated like fog before sunrise. The air became breathable again. Time resumed its normal flow. Reality solidified back into familiar patterns. But Adam himself had been permanently transformed by what he had endured. He was still fully human, but he was human in a way that no one had been since the fall. The confrontation had burned away everything in him that was merely natural and revealed the supernatural destiny that had always been hidden within the divine image. He had become living proof that humanity could choose righteousness over rebellion, truth over deception, divine authority over fallen power. Even under the most extreme pressure imaginable, and that proof would become the foundation stone upon which every future act of redemption would be built, from Noah's faithfulness during the flood, to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, to Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh, to David's victory over Goliath, to every prophet who spoke truth to power, to every martyr who chose death over compromise, to the ultimate expression of this principle in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ himself. All of it would trace back to the spiritual and legal precedents that Adam had established during his final confrontation with the Nephilim and their supernatural masters. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo through every generation until the end of time. And the man who had once brought sin into the world through his failure in Eden had now established the framework within which that sin could ultimately be overcome. Through divine grace and human faithfulness working together in perfect harmony. The flood was coming, but humanity would survive it with their essential nature intact and their destiny as God's image-bearers confirmed for all eternity. The giants would be washed away, but the spiritual principles necessary for their ultimate defeat had been permanently embedded in the legal structure of reality itself. Adam had fought the final battle between the original design and the corruption that sought to replace it. And against all odds, against overwhelming opposition, against forces that should have been able to crush him without effort, he had won. But the victory wasn't his alone. It belonged to every human being who would ever choose light over darkness, truth over lies, redemption over rebellion. It belonged to a plan that had been in motion since before time began, a plan that would ultimately result in the complete restoration of everything that sin and corruption had tried to destroy. The encounter between Adam and the Nephilim was ending. But the story it had set in motion was just beginning. A story that would continue until every enemy of humanity had been defeated, every tear had been wiped away, and every promise of redemption had been fulfilled in ways that would make even angels marvel at the wisdom and love of the one who had orchestrated it all from the very beginning. The rain began 3 days after Adam's victory. But it wasn't the gentle morning dew that had once blessed the earth in its unfallen state. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to carry the weight of divine sorrow mixed with absolute determination. Each drop that fell contained within it the accumulated grief of watching creation twisted beyond recognition, and the unshakable resolve to make all things new. Adam stood at the threshold of his dwelling, watching the sky weep tears that had been held back for generations. The water that began as scattered drops soon became sheets of liquid judgment cascading from heavens that could no longer contain the sorrow of what humanity had become. But there was something else in that rain, something that only Adam could recognize after everything he had endured. There was mercy. Not the cheap grace that overlooks rebellion, but the costly mercy that destroys corruption in order to save what can still be redeemed. Every drop that struck the earth was simultaneously an act of judgment and an act of love, removing the cancer that had spread through creation while preserving the essential core that could still remember its original purpose. The ancient texts describe Adam's final days with a poignancy that pierces through centuries of accumulated theology to touch the raw nerve of human experience. Here was a man who had lived through the entire arc of human history, from paradise to corruption to judgment. He had walked with God in perfect innocence, introduced sin through disobedience, watched evil multiply beyond imagination, and finally stood firm against the ultimate corruption that threatened to destroy not just his generation, but all future hope of redemption. Now he was watching it all wash away. But Adam wasn't mourning as one without hope. The confrontation with the fallen beings had revealed to him truths about the nature of divine love that even paradise had not fully disclosed. He understood now that God's plan had never been simply to preserve innocence, but to demonstrate something far more profound: the capacity for created beings to choose righteousness not from ignorance of alternatives, but from full knowledge of what rebellion costs and what faithfulness wins. The floodwaters rising around him weren't just removing physical corruption. They were clearing the stage for a drama that would unfold across millennia. A story of redemption that would ultimately prove the superiority of divine love over every form of rebellion that could ever be conceived. The Nephilim and their fallen masters had thought they were corrupting God's plan. In reality, they had been providing the very opposition that would make the plan's ultimate triumph all the more glorious. As the waters reached his knees, then his waist, then his chest, Adam found himself remembering not the terror of recent battles, but the joy of walking with God in Eden's garden. The same presence that had once delighted in evening conversations among perfect trees was with him now in these final moments. Not as distant judge, but as intimate friend, sharing the sorrow of necessary surgery and the anticipation of ultimate healing. The ancient accounts suggest that Adam's death came not from drowning, but from a kind of translation that bypassed the normal process of physical dissolution. As the waters closed over his head, something extraordinary happened that the texts struggle to describe in merely human language. His body remained human, but his spirit was caught up into realms where the battle he had just fought was being celebrated as a crucial victory in a war that spanned dimensions he had never imagined. He saw the Nephilim and their supernatural fathers bound in chains of darkness, awaiting a judgment that would make the flood look like a gentle spring rain. He saw the legal precedents he had established being inscribed in books that would guide divine justice throughout all future ages. He saw the framework he had preserved being used to construct a plan of redemption so elegant, so comprehensive, so perfectly suited to human nature that it would satisfy both justice and mercy in ways that would make all creation sing. But most remarkably, he saw himself, not as the man who had failed in Eden, not as the patriarch who had watched his descendants choose corruption, but as the faithful witness whose testimony had preserved humanity's right to choose redemption over rebellion throughout all future generations. His resistance to the Nephilim had earned him a place in the cosmic story that would echo until the end of time. The waters that carried away his physical form also carried away the last traces of the original corruption, the final remnants of the genetic and spiritual pollution that had threatened to make humanity irredeemably lost. As the flood reached its peak and covered even the highest mountains, it was washing the slate clean, not just physically, but spiritually, legally, and cosmically. When the waters finally receded and Noah stepped onto dry ground, He was inheriting an earth that had been reset according to the spiritual principles Adam had died to preserve. The rainbow that appeared in the clouds wasn't just a promise that physical floods wouldn't destroy the earth again. It was a covenant sign that the legal and spiritual framework necessary for ultimate redemption had been permanently established and would never again be threatened by the kind of supernatural corruption that had nearly consumed Adam's generation. But the story of Adam's encounter with the Nephilim didn't end with the flood. The precedents he had established, the authority he had exercised, the testimony he had maintained under impossible pressure, all of it became part of the spiritual DNA that would be passed down through every generation that followed. Every time a human being chose truth over deception, every time someone resisted supernatural temptation, every time a person exercised spiritual authority based on divine commission rather than fallen power, they were walking in the path that Adam had carved out through his final confrontation with the forces of darkness. The Nephilim themselves were gone, washed away by waters that had been charged with divine authority to remove every trace of their corruption. But the spiritual principles of their rebellion lived on, manifesting in new forms, creating new temptations, offering new versions of the same fundamental choice between divine authority and fallen power that Adam had faced in his final days. Throughout the Old Testament, we see echoes of Adam's battle playing out in the lives of his descendants. When Abraham was called to leave everything familiar and trust in promises that seemed impossible, he was exercising the same kind of faith that Adam had demonstrated when he refused the fallen being's offers of immediate salvation in exchange for spiritual submission. When Moses stood before Pharaoh and demanded the release of God's people, he was wielding the same kind of spiritual authority that Adam had used to command supernatural entities to leave his presence. When David faced Goliath, he wasn't just fighting a physical giant. He was confronting the same spirit of rebellion that had animated the Nephilim. The same arrogant claim that size and strength could override divine authority. His victory with a simple stone wasn't just a triumph of courage over intimidation. It was a demonstration that the spiritual principles Adam had established were still operative, still available to anyone who understood how to access them. The prophets who spoke truth to power, who resisted the temptation to tell kings what they wanted to hear, who maintained their testimony even when it cost them everything, were all walking in the tradition that Adam had established. They understood that spiritual authority came not from human appointment or supernatural empowerment, but from alignment with divine truth regardless of the personal cost. And when Christ himself entered human history, he was stepping into a world that had been prepared by Adam's faithfulness in ways that most people never recognized. The legal framework that made redemption possible. The spiritual precedents that allowed human choice to override supernatural corruption. The cosmic authority structure that enabled divine love to triumph over fallen rebellion. All of it traced back to the choices Adam had made during his final confrontation with the Nephilim. Every miracle Christ performed, every demon he cast out, every claim to divine authority he made, was building on the foundation that Adam had laid through his resistance to fallen supernatural power. When Christ commanded storms to be still, When he walked on water, when he raised the dead, he was exercising the same kind of authority that Adam had discovered during his darkest hours. The authority that came from perfect alignment between human will and divine purpose. The cross itself can only be understood in light of Adam's final battle. When Christ chose to die rather than compromise his testimony. When he refused the temptation to call down legions of angels to rescue him. When he maintained his commitment to divine love, even when it meant experiencing the full weight of human rebellion. He was making the same kind of choice that Adam had made when he refused to bow to the fallen beings who promised to save his descendants in exchange for his submission. And the resurrection that followed wasn't just Christ's personal victory over death. It was the ultimate vindication of every spiritual principle that Adam had died to preserve. It proved that divine authority really was superior to every form of fallen power. That truth really could triumph over the most sophisticated deceptions. That redemption really was possible for beings who had been corrupted beyond what seemed like any hope of recovery. The early church understood this connection in ways that later generations would lose. They recognized that their own confrontations with spiritual powers and principalities were part of the same cosmic battle that Adam had fought against the Nephilim. When they resisted the temptation to compromise with pagan authorities, when they chose martyrdom over apostasy, when they maintained their testimony about Christ's lordship even under the most extreme persecution, they were continuing the resistance that Adam had begun. The battle that began in Eden's garden and culminated in Adam's final stand against the Nephilim isn't ancient history. It's your story. Right now, in this very moment, you're facing the same fundamental choice that Adam confronted in his darkest hour. Will you bow to the voices that promise easy answers and immediate power? Or will you stand firm in the authority that comes from bearing God's image regardless of the cost? The spiritual war that Adam fought to preserve your freedom to choose is still raging, and your decision determines not just your own destiny, but the spiritual trajectory of everyone whose life you'll touch. The floodwaters have receded, but the choice remains. Choose wisely. Eternity is watching.